Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for being here. I am the chair of this panel, and I will be introducing my colleagues, our discussant, and give a short introduction to the panel. I am a PhD candidate in anthropology at the universities of Padua, Verona, and Venice, Ca' Foscari. I have a bachelor in Japanese studies and a master's in anthropology, both from Ca' Foscari. During my MA, I researched gender differences and gender discrimination in the school-to-work transition in Japan. Now my research focuses on the Japanese family register and the problem of the unregistered children in contemporary Japan. So to continue with the introductions, my colleague YAFA and MASRI, who will be starting this panel, is a PhD candidate in geographic studies, also at the universities of Padua, Verona, and Venice, and is also a managing committee member of the COST, Decolonizing Development Network. As a Palestinian refugee herself, she is writing her PhD dissertation on post-development approaches to livelihood from Lebanon's Palestinian refugee camps. And then my colleague CRISTINA ARCARI, who will be second in the panel, graduated in modern literature and historical sciences at the University of Milan, where she researched gender history in medieval times. She is currently completing her PhD in historical, geographical, and anthropological sciences in our same university, and with a thesis on female petitions in mid-14th century Bologna. And last but not least, our discussant that we thank for being here is Denise BEZZINA, who obtained her PhD in history from the University of Turin with a thesis on craftsmen in 12th and 13th century Genoa. Her research, based primarily on notarial records, has focused on the non-mercantile, non-aristocratic segment of society, with the aim to assess the role of the lower social strata amid the changes in the social, economic, and political structures of the city during the Central and later Middle Ages. More recently, she has shifted her attention towards gender issues, and especially on the nature and management of non-dotal goods. She is currently working on a Marie Sklodowska-Curie action project entitled Kinship, Alliance, and Urban Space, the Genoese alberghi in the late Middle Ages. So to introduce our panel, the idea for this panel was born from a conversation between my colleagues and I, in which we realized that our research projects had something in common despite us being in different disciplines, history, anthropology, and geography. All of us had encountered, either physically or through historical documents, women who managed to reach their goals, to have agency, even when and where societies created obstacles and seemingly inescapable paths for them to follow. But we also realized that these women were not fighting the system. They were not necessarily against the hegemonic values of their society. They were taking advantage of what was available to them strategically to have their way in a world that was against them. And this led us to a reflection on the definition of agency that led to this panel. The refugee women in Lebanon, the women victim of patrimonial violence in the Middle Ages, and the women, young women job hunting in Tokyo that we encountered during our work all had something in common. They were not revolutionaries, they didn't fight the system, but they were not helpless. They were determined, strong women who strategically found ways to get what they wanted. Therefore, we decided to focus on agency in our panel, and we adopted the definition of agency by Judith Butler, further elaborated by anthropologist Saba Mahmoud as an open, unfixed, historically and culturally specific category, not always moved by a desire for freedom and subversion of norms, a definition that relinquishes it from what she calls the teleology of progressive politics of the liberal feminist theory. This redefinition of agency allows us to better understand women's strategies that might not be neither collective nor necessarily subversive or transformative as a capacity for effective action. This panel aims at proving the benefit of such a definition through the interdisciplinary analysis of 3 case studies across time and space. So to start, I will leave the floor to my colleague YAFA. YAFA, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being here today despite the early hours and the pandemic. I know everyone is very tired of being on Zoom by now, but let's hope we can use this for sharing some really interesting information. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and hopefully you're able to see my PowerPoint. Basically, as Anna already introduced, I'm a PhD candidate in geographic studies, and my PhD research basically focuses on solidarity among refugees. But it's divided into a few chapters, and for this certain chapter, for this specific part of my research, I'm working on solidarity among refugee women. So I'm working more on sisterhoods. So this chapter is still a very early stage of work, and therefore I wanted to share with you what I have established so far in this part of the research. However, it's not a concluded piece of work on sisterhoods that are shaping Lebanon's Palestinian refugee camps. To start off, a little bit about sisterhoods. I always like to use the work of Bell Hooks, who spoke a lot of women on the margins and who discussed her interesting theory of how she thinks that women can nurture and harvest power from solidarity among each other. And Hooks was very interesting in the way she defines this relationship of bonding between women as sisterhoods. So she elaborates on her idea that women throughout history are taught and urged to believe that they can only achieve value by themselves by linking themselves to men. And we're taught that there is no value by linking ourselves as women to other women. And that the only relationships that are enriching to us are our relationships to men. However, our relationships to women are seen as diminishing. Even worse, Bell Hooks criticizes the way we're actually conditioned to think of our relationships to women, not just as diminishing, but to also look at women as our natural enemies. She goes on to explain how also certain feminist approaches, when they do call for sisterhoods or when they do call for bonding between women, they call for such bonding on the basis of shared victimization. But using the bonding of women on the basis of shared victimizations is quite problematic, because then that would mean that women always have to feel as victims for their feminist movements to make sense or to be relevant. But then also, what about women who are not victimized or who are not victimized anymore? On which basis are they going to bond with their sisters, if that's the basis? So she argues that we should not base our notion of sisterhoods on shared victimization, but on shared strength, shared beliefs, shared interests. And in general, she refers to sisterhoods as this solidarity among women, which is made in a sustainable and ongoing commitment to supporting each other. So she differentiates between support, women supporting women, and sisterhoods, because support is something occasional and temporary. It could come and go. But the sisterhoods is a notion of a sustainable and ongoing commitment to supporting each other as women. Now, to introduce the particular case that I'm here to speak about today, I speak of a very peculiar case, which I hope will allow me to look at sisterhoods from a very understudied place. In my research, or in this part of the research, I try basically to understand how women create sisterhoods in Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. And basically, I want to understand how these sisterhoods have shaped, but also continue to shape life and space in a refugee community. A little bit of a background on the space under study. Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon host a population of around 500,000 stateless Palestinian refugees. And normally these spaces are dubbed as spaces of exception. So in the definition of Agamben, spaces of exception are the spaces that imply a suspension of political life. For Palestinian refugee camps, especially in Lebanon, they are, Palestinians in general are the world's biggest stateless community, but the Palestinians in Lebanon have also quite a particular case because they are not under the protection of the Lebanese state or the host state, because Lebanon is not a signatory to refugee conventions. Palestinians in Lebanon are also the exception to the world's protection regime, as they are not under the authority of the UNHCR. They're not also under the protection of the Palestinian state because they are stateless. So we're speaking about an unprotected community in every sense, and a state of exception or a space of exception in every sense. Palestinian refugees in Lebanon are only protected by a very small and underfunded UN agency that's called UNRWA, which is United Nations Relief and Works Agency. And what makes the situation of Palestinian refugees also more particular is that in Lebanon, in this space, the situation of refugees in general, not just Palestinian refugees, but also refugees from different countries, is quite extreme and is quite particular, because Lebanon is actually the country with the world's highest rate of refugee per capita, meaning that Lebanon is the country with the highest percentage of refugees in the entire world, according to the statistics of UNHCR for the past few years. So Lebanon has a total population of 6 million people, in which 1.5 million of this population are refugees from Syria. 500,000 are refugees, Palestinian refugees, in addition to tens of thousands of refugees from countries like Iraq, Sudan, Ethiopia, and many other. So 1/3 of the population in Lebanon are refugees, which makes their situation quite extreme. But it's also worth asking, how are these refugees viewed? And more importantly for our panel today, how are women refugees viewed in Lebanon? A very important Lebanese qualitative content analysis study was done by an organization named Abad. They are a resource center that works on gender issues. And they have conducted this study in 2015 and 2016, and they actually covered 6 of the most prominent Lebanese media outlets. And the study specifically finds that refugee women were represented in a very negative manner, like the title of the report obviously demonstrates. And it clearly says the way that these refugees are showed in a victim kind of representation with no political, social, or economic roles. And with the coverage of gender issues being extensively showed, but only gender issues that underline women in their traditional roles and their vulnerability to human trafficking and exploitation. They also, for example, criticize the way visual media is extensively used to demonstrate women as caregivers or women who are being rescued from human trafficking. And they criticize the way this kind of selective reporting perpetuates this representation of women as helpless, and thus enables the community to keep practicing an approach towards them as helpless victims. So now, in general, we have the issue of refugee women in Lebanon who are at the margin in every sense. They're women, they're brown, they're refugees, they're represented as helpless, and thus they are forced to stay that way. So through this part of the research, through ethnographic and autoethnographic recordings, I try to understand a little bit about how Palestinian refugee women establish sisterhoods and solidarity. And to do that, I tried to look at sisterhoods, not just now, but also throughout the last years of the refugee history in Lebanon. And one of the most prominent stories that kept coming up was when I was always at the camp of Ain al-Hilwa, which is considered the capital of the diaspora. And there was always one story that kept getting repeated between refugees, which is the story of this refugee camp as a kingdom of women. So Ain al-Hilwa is the largest Palestinian refugee camp in the south of Lebanon. It was built in 1948. But after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the entire camp was actually destroyed, completely in ruins, and every single man in the camp was actually imprisoned. So technically, this camp was just left in ruins, and where the only people left are the women and the children with absolutely no resources. Of course, in this kind of condition, they are in a state of waiting. And I really like the important work of Alison Mounts on waiting, where she actually explains the experiences of people who are waiting, of people who are displaced, who have been mobile, but then they are immobile in their place. They are stuck and unable to move. And her work is really inspiring to me because she keeps saying that people who are waiting are not in a state of lacking action, especially women. And she says that waiting is a time where the very simple things such as sickness, childbirth, language acquisition, every little thing is rather a strategy to survive, and thus in itself is a political action. So she says that during this waiting, it's the time when women discover, understand, change, and come to terms with the place where they are waiting. And this kind of perspective suggests the different ways in which waiting can be appropriated as a part of a feminist political project. So waiting is not about being fixed, it's not about being stuck. It's actually dynamic. Just being there is something dynamic, is something political, and is an act of resistance. So while these women have been waiting for their partners to return, this period between 1982 and 1984 was such an integral chapter in the history of Palestinian women that everybody was talking about this stunning display of resilience. Everybody was talking about these women who have lost everything. And then the Israeli army at that point has decided to put them in tents after taking away their partner and leaving them with nothing. And these women actually decided to fight back. They decided to distract the army who's planning to put them in tents, and then the rest of the women actually burned down the tents. It was a way of saying, this is our life, we live here, you're not going to put us in tents, we are agents of our own life. After a while, also the humanitarian agencies decided to reorganize the plots that have been destroyed, to reorganize the camp that has been completely destroyed, and to decide for people how they are going to live in this rebuilt camp. But these women actually rejected it completely, and they said, we used to live here, we built these houses, and we are going to rebuild them. So what they actually did is that they took all the ruins of the destroyed camp, and with these very minimum resources of only the remainders of a camp that once existed, they rebuilt the camps in their own hands. So that specific camp was rebuilt by these women with their own hands. But also we have to take into consideration that while waiting for their partners to come back, they were caring for their children, they were caring for their elders, they were caring for their families, and they were providing for people who rely on them while their partners were being held captive. So we could watch the agency of these women and the solidarity among these women to create the agency when they didn't have resources or partners or help from someone other than women themselves. This scene today really doesn't look that much different. So if we look at Palestinian refugee women today, they're still waiting, but they're still, by being, they are resisting. The same notion of sisterhoods and solidarity among women does still prevail, both formally and informally. So in a space of exception where there's no law that protects women from gender-based violence, it's always women protecting women. It's always the notion of sisterhood protecting women from violence. In times of food insecurity, for example, it's always the women who are agents or in charge of the food of the family that are supporting each other to try to define the food insecurity challenges. For example, in the statistics of UNRWA for the last few years, UNRWA states that 64% of Palestinians in Lebanon suffer from at least some type of food insecurity. And half of these people actually cope with that through food sharing. So it's these women who are in charge of the production of food in general in their homes in a very informal manner are the ones that are mitigating or reducing the suffering of other families through this very informal act of food sharing. But even more formally, these sisterhoods have led to the birth of so many sisterhood-based projects. For example, one of the projects that I really fancy is in Burj al Barajni refugee camp, and it's called Sufra. And Sufra is a project of women who had this really strong notion of sisterhood and connection to each other, but they also wanted to improve their family livelihoods and they wanted to show their connection to their culture. So these women got together and launched this small crowdfunding campaign at a very grassroots level. And with the very minimum resources, they managed to make a small catering company where they cook traditional Palestinian food, they distribute it and they sell it. And with the proceedings, not only do they provide for their families, but they also provide food for the food insecure families around the camp. And the project actually expanded, and these women decided to challenge every single mobility restriction that there is and every single social and economic restriction that there is. That with the proceedings, they decided to establish a food truck. And this food truck now promotes Palestinian food and Palestinian culture through navigating all over Lebanon. And today the project actually consists of 40 women who are not just Palestinian, but they are Iraqi, Syrian refugees, and even Lebanese women. So we could see how the sisterhood was more expanding and welcoming and building on this strength to try to manage living and surviving in such a space of exception. Now, as I said, this is still a work in a very early stage, but what I'm trying to identify or to understand in this research that these women were not only sisters in experiencing the pain and the agony, but they were also sisters in the strength of repairing and building and developing their own lives, but also their entire community. So it is through these shared experiences of displacement that they were building hopes and dreams of a new home or a better life, not the other way around. So the basis for this relationship is not necessarily the shared displacement, it's the hope and the need to build a better home or a better future. And the conclusion basically of this research, what I'm trying to say is that I'm trying to shed light on the role of sisterhoods in shaping the space of refugee camps. We have seen somehow the way it's transforming these refugee camps from spaces of exception where nothing happened, where there's no political power, to spaces of rescue and power and agency, especially of women. So throughout the case that I've mentioned, we've seen how sisterhoods are transforming the camp space through resisting certain spatial structures, through building other spatial structures that they see as appropriate. We've seen them changing territorialities. We've seen them crossing boundaries and borders. We've seen them making the camp more porous through purposeful exchanges and mobility. So there is a need to recognize the role of sisterhoods in shaping history, but also in shaping geography. There's been a lot of research, for example, on sisterhoods shaping history, like between Jewish women in concentration camps and their sisterhoods. Also the sisterhoods between single mothers in Mexico. But we also need to recognize the role of sisterhoods in changing the geography on a spatial level, on a human level, and on a political level. This is the end of my presentation. I would also like to ask for your comments, your feedback, your recommendations on a literature or ideas or suggestions that you think would be ideal for this research. And I thank you for listening. And I hope you found that interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Yafa. That was very interesting, a very interesting presentation. And since we are leaving the questions for later, I will now leave the floor to Cristina.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Yafa, for this wonderful presentation. I was very inspired. So let's change space and time. We are going to go on in Bologna in the 14th century. So today we are speaking on women agency, and in my special case, patrimonial violence in 14th century Bologna. During the lordship of Taddeo Pepoli over Bologna since 1337 and 1350, a new type of document was produced by the Lord's Court, the petition or the suppliche in Italian. This document made possible to subjects of all social status and gender to approach the Lord, asking for justice in a fast and cheap way. The main aim of this speech is to reflect on how Bolognese women use this method to obtain justice over acts of patrimonial violence, focusing especially on women's agency shown through the petitions. Using a case study from a 1338 petition, I will highlight how women could have agency in this peculiar historical context, and what could they do to obtain justice. We will address the concept of patrimonial violence, a contemporary concept used on medieval situation in this case, and how women could respond to this violence. Furthermore, this petition enables us to reflect over women's self-representation and identity regarding how women chose to speak of themselves using the supplica and what gender ideals are revealed by it. The historical context we're moving in is Taddeo Pepoli's lordship over the city of Bologna during the first half of the 14th century. Pepoli became lord in 1337 after the short ruling of Cardinal Bertrando of Poggetto, who took over the city between 1327 and 1334. And Bertrando of Poggetto imported the suppliche from the Vatican court. The new lord of Bologna understood the potential of this kind of document and used it abundantly over the years of his lordship. The petition, born in ancient times, we can have traces of similar documents in ancient Egypt or classical Rome, but in the medieval times were structured and formalized by the Pope courts. A petition is an individual request to an authority made by an individual or a group of people asking for an authority for a favor or a criminal grace. The authority could be the Pope, the King, the Lord, or the Communal Council, and it's common all over the Europe space. Was used during medieval and modern times, and it still remains in contemporary times. In Italian legislation, we have the grazia at the President of the Repubblica, where inmates could ask for mercy, and it's kind of the same. During Taddeo Pepoli's lordship, about 500 petitions were per year were accepted by the Lord's Court, nearly 5,000 petitions during the 10 years of his ruling. On 6 registers of provvigioni, that are the ordinances from which Pepoli ruled, On a total of 1,041 petitions, the 22.5% addressed a problem about women, and the 8.9% were made by women. Since the classic works of Nathalie Zemon-Davis and Claude Gauvard on the Lettres de Rémission, made in the French area during the medieval and modern times, historiography had reflected over the petition and how to study this peculiar source. One of the methods proposed to address this kind of documents posed the historian in two different positions. The first one saw the historian as a storyteller, underlying how the tales narrated in the petition could be a source of information about how life was lived when the act was written. The other one saw the historian as a translator who faces the symbol and rhetoric used in the petition, trying to study how these documents were written and what that said about medieval times. The method most used in recent years focused on the literacy quality of the text, because the truth of the tales written in the petition was very questioned. In this speech, I will focus on the text, but also on the tale, because even considering a rhetoric point of view, the facts narrated by the petitioners reflect acts of patrimonial violence and underline women's agency in response to this violence. Before addressing the case study, it's mandatory to define what is agency and patrimonial violence in my peculiar context. Agency, by definition, is the ability of an individual to act or exert power. The concept was theorized by social science during the last half of the 20th century. When women's studies entered the conversation, the female agency was seen as an opposition to social norms and to the oppressive male power. But the studies of Judith Butler and Michel Foucault, reflecting on power and subject formation, proposed a way to bypass the male power, female submission dichotomy. And female agency became an ability to act that doesn't necessarily goes against the patriarchal system in which take place. Female agency in a medieval time could be studied searching the ways in which individual women could act in a patriarchal regime, acts that doesn't necessarily try to weaken gender hierarchy. Patrimonial violence, by definition, is the violation of women's property right, their ability to own and manage the individual or joint property to which they are entitled. It's a type of violence against women recognized from the early years of this century by UN and Istanbul Convention. It's a concept theorized in recent times, and the methodology to study it derived from ethnographic and anthropological papers. But using a tailor-made methodology, this concept can be used to study a medieval situation, as I will explain during this speech. The case study we are addressing today is a supplica made by Azolina de Zainardi and registered in the Provisioni in March 3038. Azolina and her son Giovanni wrote a petition to Taddeo Pepoli to address a peculiar situation of patrimonial violence. Azolina starts the plea speaking of her problematic marriage. Her husband from 30 years, Bonafide, decided 10 years prior to take a lover, Amasia in the source, with whom he had children. Bonafide and his lover abused Azolina, had hurt her and even tried to kill her. So Azolina decided to move away from her house, but made a deal with her husband that promised to give her an annual alimony, but this money was never delivered. In the petition highlighting her poverty, Azolina wrote to the Lord asking her last possession, her dowry, even if her marriage wasn't over, fearing that Bonafide will dissipate her property, stripping their son of his inheritance. The ending of this litigation is unknown, but since the petition was accepted, probably Bonafide was forced to repay Azolina of her property, giving her back her dowry. This petition allows us to underline various situations. In the first place, Azolina's tale shows that Bonafide and his lover used physical and patrimonial violence over her, forcing her out of her home and leaving her and her son in poverty. Bonafide took away what was rightfully of Azolina, the income, the alimony promised when she left the house, a right put on paper that Azolina dutifully mentioned in the supplica. The other sign of patrimonial violence is the threat of losing her dowry after Bonafide's death. His dangerous habit to dissipate money and property could have been harmful to his son's inheritance, forcing Azolina to ask for her dowry during her marriage. The Latin formula is costante matrimonio. Having highlighted the acts of patrimonial violence suffered by Azolina, it is possible to analyze her agency regarding this peculiar situation. The main act of agency made by Azolina is to ask for her dowry back, an act that highlights Azolina's knowledge of her rights and her will to press them. The act of making a petition is itself a great show of agency because it indicates not only the democratic accessibility of the petitions, but also a great resolution to obtain justice in a situation clearly unjust, even in her time. Another aspect showed by this petition concerned the question of women's voice in petition, a problem very discussed by historiography. Since Demon Davis' work, the problem of the petitioner voice was addressed by historians, trying to understand if it's possible to study people's voice using this source. The most shared opinions say that petition doesn't show the real voice of the petitioners, because to build and write a petition was necessary the intervention of a notary or a scriba. Petitions, so, are a teamwork, and it's impossible to discern the real voice of petitioners. However, Cordelia Bidi recently wrote that women's gender ideals and expectations could have been shaped the text of petition. If women's voice is impossible to study, women's gender ideals and expectation that could shape the text could be analyzed. Azolina's petition shows how she perceived herself and how she would like to be perceived in terms of gender ideals. She is drawn as a good and loyal wife, abused by her husband and his illegitimate lover, a good mother who tried to protect her son's inheritance, and a good subject who searched her Lord justice, equity, and mercy. One of the biggest issues addressed by historiography regards the truth of the tale. One of the motives why the translation approach was mainly used instead of the storyteller one is that we can know for sure if the tales written in the petition were completely true. These documents were made to be accepted by the authority, so were shaped in a way that made them plausible and acceptable. Obviously, the Lord will do an inquiry to be sure that everything said was true, and that's why Azolina bring documents and legal proof of their rights, of her rights. But nevertheless, the truth could be manipulated for the aim of the petition. In Azolina's case, we don't have a cross-examination. We can be sure of the level of abuse suffered by her. But the result of her petition was positive. So the situation suffered won't be so different from the reality. Furthermore, the petition contained a great deal of rhetoric and legal formulary useful to the petitioner and the authority. Azolina stressed her poverty, begged for mercy and equity, all values that Taddeo Pepoli wanted to be associated with to him and his ruling. In a government by grace, as Taddeo Pepoli, the Lord has every reason to be seen by his ruler as a merciful father and a dutifully judge, risking less delegitimation. In conclusion, the petitions are a useful source to analyze patrimonial violence and women's agency against it. And Azolina petition shows different strategies that could be used by women and by the Lord in resolution of patrimonial disputes. Furthermore, the petitions allows us to reflect about women's voice and self-representation, other than gender ideals and expectation. At the same time, the rhetoric used in this text shows the Lord's strategy and aim for his legitimation, okay, can do it, and his ruleship. And thank you for your attention. I was a little fast.
Thank you, Cristina. I didn't perceive it as fast.
Okay.
It was very interesting.
Thank you.
So now it's time for my presentation. This presentation is based on my master thesis, and it's about job hunting in Japan and gender differences and forms of gender discrimination in the school, in this case university, to work transition in Tokyo. To give you some background information on my fieldwork, I did 9 months of ethnographic fieldwork between 2017 and 2018, mainly at Waseda University in Tokyo. I interviewed during this time 14 female students, 6 male students, and 2 professionals. One was the head of the career center in Waseda, and the other one was an employee of an agency that helps match companies with female workers in specifically. And then I did extensive participant observation at job fairs aimed at students and at what are called kaisha setsumeikai, which are basically open days for companies to meet the students, and then seminars, which are classes attended by students to learn how to be successful in job hunting. So to give you some context, in the last decades, Japan, as many other countries, has experienced a declining birth rate and a rapidly aging population, but more rapidly than any other country. So the economy is deeply affected by this because of the insufficient workforce turnover that results from it. So in the last decades, there has been a lot of debate and a lot of effort put into changing the old style management of human resources, a transition that is called hatarakikata kaikaku in Japanese, in order to solve the problem. So for former President Shinzo Abe, the solution was women. He is reported to have said that women are the most underutilized resource in Japan, meaning that if they worked more, the economy would be better off. For this reason, and certainly not for the sake of gender equality, he developed what's called Womenomics, a set of strategies aimed at giving women more career opportunities by encouraging women to shine and by making companies more women-friendly, like asking companies to be more women-friendly. But this was always, in every white paper, explicitly linked to one reason for wanting to encourage women. So the need to the need for women to have more children. Basically, they are encouraged to both work, therefore helping the economy in the short run, and to have more children, so to help the economy in the long run. Now, how does Shūkatsu, which is job hunting in Japanese, enter the picture? It's the moment when adult society opens its gate to its youth. If university students are successful, they won't only have a job, they will become shakaijin, which means a person of society. So technically an adult, but in the meaning of a functional member of society, as society expects them to be. And it is a time very interesting because it is filled with dense symbolism about what adult masculinity should look like and what adult femininity should look like. It is a very interesting phenomenon to look at because it's also because it's collective. Students all follow the same schedule, they attend the same fairs and the same classes, and they all wear the same suits, the same shoes, they carry the same bags, have the same hairstyle, even the same posture. So what is it like for girls specifically? Is it different? I would say very much so. While I was in Tokyo, I discovered quite a big niche of websites and classes and even entire job fairs exclusively for women. And at first I imagined they would aim at giving advice to young women on how to have a successful career despite gender inequality in the workplace. But instead, I was very surprised to find something like this. They were actually, these events, these fairs, these meetings with companies, they were all about maternity leave and working part-time when you have children, and how to be a mother and a professional, how girls shouldn't be afraid to work because they will have the chance to have children, taking for granted that they want to have children and that is a priority for them. So they are about how to balance motherhood and a career, and how to find a company that is women-friendly enough to allow you to do that. These events covered extensively the topic of maternity leave and benefits for employees with children, specifying that, according to law, these benefits are given to both women and men. But these topics were talked about only to audiences of young women. Young men don't have the chance to know about these systems because they are never there when they talk about it. So these are the three main tropes that I found in all of these events. To keep working, which means not giving up one's job when you have children, but take maternity leave and then come back. Of course, this is useful to companies. To find your working style, which is an odd one, basically women are expected to not adapt to the work environment, to not adapt to the company, companies are mostly male dominated, and they are expected to all want to be mothers. And so they are encouraged to find their own style in order to juggle both maternity and career. And then work-life balance. That can easily be changed into work-children balance in this case, because it will make no difference in the way that they talk about it. Because the fundamental message given to young women in this context is that they're expected to want to be mothers and to also to be the primary caregivers of their children. Another difference, a very important difference, is in the choice girls have to make and that boys are deprived of. Basically, old traditional Japanese companies, which are the most powerful, old and rich, divide their employees in 2 and sometimes 3 tracks that you see here. Boys are all expected to go for managerial track, the hardest and the most paid, one, because they are all expected to privilege work over family and to earn more than their future wives. My respondents often told me that it would be extremely weird if a young man, a guy, didn't choose the managerial track, to the extent that they would think he was disabled if he did. Because to find an explanation to the fact that he didn't choose the hardest, most desirable track, he must have been disabled, which is surprising to me. Well, women have to decide, they actually have the choice. They have to decide before entering the workforce if they want to either work more or be at home more. If they choose the clerical track, they won't have promotions, they would have a much lower pay, but they would stick to office hours. While the regional track is something in between managerial and clerical, but it's still chosen by women only, because it allows for a lesser degree of career advancement. So as you can read in the upper half of the slide, these tracks, they actually mask what is really a sexual division of labor, and they constitute the offer of a choice to the individuals at the point of entry that not only fulfills the equal treatment requirement of the Equal Employment Opportunity Law, but also automatically justifies the differential wage system, training and promotion opportunities accorded for the different class of employees in different career tracks. And for different class, it's usually meant different gender. So let's look at some figures just to have an idea. These are the male graduates at Waseda University in 2016. As you can see in the third column from the right, these are the numbers of young men that chose managerial track. And in the other two columns, it's the number for regional track and clerical track, and it's all blank, it's 0. And if you look at the same year, Waseda graduates, but female graduates, 215 of them chose regional track and 31 the clerical one. And these numbers might be even lower than in other universities because Waseda is a very prestigious and very expensive university. So we can expect students to be more career-oriented at Waseda since they invested so much time, so much effort, and so much money in their education. So why should women find their style? Traditional Japanese companies are male-dominated, but also symbolically male, pretty much as the army is. The standard of what the company expects from you is based on an ideal male worker. And I say ideal because, of course, it does not reflect the desires and actual ambitions of real men. It's what the companies want. So this ideal is corporate heroic masculinity of the salaryman that sacrifices himself for the company, the enduring of often unpaid overtime work, the mandatory after-work drinks that prevent you from going home to your family. They're mandatory in the sense that your boss expects you to be there, and the expectation to earn as much as you can to be a good father. So if companies are masculine, of course, on a symbolical level, women, of course, are expected to enter them in another way, from a cultural, symbolic point of view, a way that is considered feminine. So the Womenomics rhetoric, the work like woman rhetoric, does not challenge the status quo in any way. It actually stresses the already existing sexual division of labor. And that's why it really cannot work. It cannot find a solution to the demographic crisis. To give you a concrete example, women of how strong is the symbolic masculinity in the company, women who work in the managerial track, there are women who work in the managerial track, and they, if they work as hard as men and they are competitive and successful as them, they might be seen, and they are often seen, as not feminine enough because they are considered closer to a masculine ideal. One of my respondents, Kanae, who wanted to work in the managerial track, told me that she was afraid that she would be called Yaju, which means beast, like wild animal beast in Japanese, because she heard that women in the managerial track are sometimes called that by their colleagues, because since they have the stamina to work like men, they are considered to be necessarily something strange and wild and masculine, so something that is not feminine, something that is between the feminine and the masculine. So how did my respondents actually enter the workforce? Well, I would argue that they did so in their own way, but not in the sense that companies want them to. For example, Ayuko was well aware that companies who divide their employees in tracks use it as an excuse to discriminate women, and she chose not to apply to them. In this way, she limited her choices very much, and she applied only to startups or international companies. And in the end, she was hired by a company, Recruit, that offered everything that she wanted. I decided instead to not give credit to companies saying that they are women-friendly, because she was aware that they use it as a strategy to have more women work for them because they need more employees. And instead, she chose companies based on salary they were offering and on the percentage of women in a managerial position. She saw this as a much more accurate way of determining if a company gave the same opportunities to women and men. Finally, Kanae, the same person who told me about her fears about entering the managerial track, she finally gave priority to her career, even if she was afraid she wouldn't be perceived as feminine enough, and that this might even make it harder for them to find a husband in the future if she lived in such a masculine work environment that didn't consider her feminine enough. And even if she hoped to have children in the future, she didn't give up her ambitions and had a very successful Shūkatsu. She was hired by a very famous, very big company. So when I was trying to interpret their actions and decisions, I realized I really admire them for their strength, but the paradigm I was using to interpret their actions didn't allow me to see them as having agency, because they were not against the system. They did not have feminist ideas. They did not actively challenge the status quo. But still, they managed to get what they wanted by being very aware of how their workplace is male-dominated, and by finding strategies within the system, following the rules, to overcome obstacles and get what they wanted. So we can't say Womenomics worked at all. The birth rate is still declining. And the Womenomics strategies started in 2013. Because the majority of women might not be actively protesting the status quo, but they are choosing not to marry or to marry later and or not to have children. So it seems like women are prioritizing their career. So could choosing not to have children, despite being a painful choice for many, be a form of agency? Could the falling birth rate be a form of agency? I would say so. And if the government really wanted to solve the demographic crisis, they should listen to what these women are silently telling with their choices and start encouraging men to engage in child rearing instead of encouraging women to work more, because women are working and want to work. So I chose to adopt the definition of agency by Saba Mahmood because it gave a voice to the admiration that I felt for these young women. She defines it as not a synonym for resistance to relations of domination, but a capacity for action that historically specific relations of subordination enable and create. And I think this definition allows us to both acknowledge the obstacles these women face and also their ability to circumvent them. Thank you. That was the end of my presentation. So now I think we can ask our discussant if she has any questions, and later open the floor to the public's questions.
Thank you very much to Anna, Cristina, and YAFA for their very interesting papers. I've addressed female agency across time and space, and they have offered us very different perspectives on three seemingly very distant situations and contexts. So we have women seeking to uphold their rights in late medieval Bologna, young women looking for their first job in contemporary Japan, and women living in Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. I only wanted to make a few comments based on what I've listened and what I've read. You've kindly sent me your papers beforehand. So perhaps the first consideration to make is what is agency? It is the keyword of this panel. And it's also a notion and a term which we commonly use when considering gender, and which at times can be mis or overly used. And in this sense, and Anna has highlighted this at the beginning of the panel, and as well as the other speakers. In this sense, one risk is to assume that agency implies subverting existing rules, to see it as counter-hegemonic behavior, as it may. We all love female rebels and misfits, but most often agency is expressed in a rather more subtle way. And this is not because women are unable to overturn rules, but because at times they simply don't want to, or they don't feel the need to. And at the end of the day, it is often women themselves who play a very important role in reproducing gender roles and social standards, and some are very happy to do so. And as a medievalist, I see this very much in the sources I study. Women who play by the rules and who are very much aware of their limits and possibilities, but know how to exploit them for their own interests, which can very well coincide with that of with the interests of their husbands or their families, are those who very often are able to exhibit an increased capacity of action. So I agree, a broader definition of agency needs to be taken into account, as it has been stressed. Actions that exhibit agency are those through which an individual manages to fulfill a pre-established objective, irrespective of whether this complies with social expectations, norms, and hierarchies, or if it serves to thwart or dismantle them. In this sense, one first point which emerged from all the three papers is boundaries. What are the limits within which these women can act, and how can they overcome or circumvent them in order to reach an aim? The case were explored by Cristina, for example, unravels in a context, which is a late medieval Italian commune, which was notoriously unfavorable to women, whose capacity of action was reduced dramatically by the introduction of successive laws. But despite this, there were legal checks in place to ensure that whatever female patrimonial rights the law upheld were protected. Therefore, here in Cristina's case, agency is visible less as an attempt on the part of Azolina to overturn norms and conventions than in her awareness of how to effectively claim her rights. In Anna's case study, as she has pointed out in her conclusion, the young women she interviewed similarly moved within the boundaries imposed by social conventions in Japan and the provisions established by Womenomics. But all three young women, which Anna mentioned, weighed very carefully their options in order to turn the situation to their advantage and land a job which fit nonetheless their own ambitions and aspirations. In short, they managed to find, or at least they tried to find their own ideal ideal of the work-life balance. Conversely, YAFA's paper, which describes a context in which there is sort of political and legal vacuum in terms of protection and gender protection from gender-based violence, and a state of emergency, offers a glimpse at women pushing and redefining boundaries, and even very tangibly, physically and materially, we see women reconstructing the camps. YAFA's case study shows how within a space of and a prolonged state of exception, female agency has profound repercussions from a socio-economic perspective, but it is also very much political. In short, these three case studies have shown both the subtler nuances of female agency and the more perhaps blatant, impactful, and change-inducing results of women's action. A second aspect, which has emerged from the three, concerns the difference between individual and collective agency. Anna has stressed at the beginning that you don't need the collective, sometimes it's the individual, but in the three papers, there's this difference between Christina's and Anna's case studies and YAFA's. So here again, in Christina and Anna's, the case studies, despite the distance in space and time, there is some resemblance, because in both cases, the initiative is taken by individual women. We have Azolina in the 14th century, and we have Ayuko and Kanae, and all the other young women looking for their first employment in Japan. And this is just a couple of years ago, and perhaps right now. So whether or not their decisions and choices were taken solo or with some aid or influence, they reflect personal needs and aims. Although one would argue, at least in the case of Japan, to what extent can the sum of individual choices can impinge on the outcome of the policies enacted by the government, which is something which Anna has commented at the end, that at the end of the day, the choices that women are making are almost collective, and and these choices may jeopardize the outcome of Womenomics. In YAFA's paper, instead, we see a very resourceful and resilient, which is the word which YAFA used, group in action. We see sisterhoods whose agency is reflected also in their ability to coordinate their actions in pursuit of common goals for the collectivities. And we must assume that is this ability to unite effort, coupled with the constant states of uncertainty, which enables bolder and diverse part of these women. And one final point I'd like to make is methodological, and it concerns finding women's voices in order to evaluate agency, which can be especially problematic in chronologically distant context. While more contemporary case study may have the advantage of direct access to female speech, those who work on the more remote past have to deal with the distortions of often ready-made or excessively formulaic documentation, for example, the supplica, which have been analyzed by Christina. And there is a necessity to read between the lines in order to gauge the capacity of action of women. I don't know how we want to proceed. I do have a couple of questions for you. So I don't know if anyone wants to, anyone of you or of the audience wants to comment, or if I can ask some questions to you.
I think Elisa will let us know if we have questions or comments from the audience. So for now, if we don't have, I don't see anything in the chat, so maybe we can go on with our questions to each other. Yafa, you raised your hand.
Yes, thank you, ladies, for the presentations. I was really inspired about both the cases of Bolognese women and women in Japan. And I think I was really inspired by the presentation of Anna that I did want to make a note and a question. One of the things that you said that were really interesting for me was this responsibility that is being shed on women as being both the caregivers and workers outside. And it reminded me of a recent literature that was from psychology by Bruce Perry, which was pointing out to a very different context. It was pointing out to tribal communities, and it was making this kind of comparison of how today women are expected to do both and to be in the job market and still take care of children and being the sole responsible person of caregiving. And he makes this kind of comparison by saying how in tribal communities, it used to be the entire tribe or the entire community that is providing care for the child, where it's the grandparents and brothers and sisters and cousins and uncles and the entire community participating in caregiving to the child. So it's not like we think that it was always the mother taking care of the child and the man was hunting or is providing the economic means, and rather it was always the entire community that is doing the caregiving. So it was never the sole responsibility of women. So why should it be today the sole responsibility of women, and that it's not logical? But the question I wanted to pose to you was actually regarding what you mentioned, that this university where you performed this research is a somehow upper class or prestigious university. And I was wondering, we've seen this acts of agency and strength practiced by these students. And I was wondering, does the class, the social class or the economic situation make a difference in this case? So what I'm asking is, do you think if you would have interviewed women of a different social class or of a less prestigious university, do you think their approach towards the job market would have been different? Do you think they would have had less, let's say, resilience towards the job market? They would have been less selective in that sense? Do you think it would have been different?
Thank you, Yafa. That's a very good question. And just to comment on your comment, which was also very interesting. Actually, I think, well, in contemporary Japan right now, since the 90s, there has been this, the so-called 3 years myth that has been circulating, first of all, the academia in the psychological area, and then it became like used in public discourse. And even if it's a very, very old theory, it's very, it's thought as true by the common sense of people right now. And the 3 years myth is basically the fact that people in Japan really believe that a mother, not the father, but the mother, is essential to the growth, the healthy growth of the child, especially in the first 3 years. And you are really frowned upon if you are not always with your child during those first 3 years. And that also has consequences on the fact that women are considered to be not only the primary caregivers and the member of the couple that is more interested in children, but also the person whom the children loves the most. And so fathers are often completely alienated also from their children, because they don't have time and because they believe the children don't need them. But this is, of course, this is a generalization. But the 3 years myth is what comes to mind if we are talking about this. And regarding class difference and difference in what's called gakureki, so the name of your university in Japan is, the gakureki is very, very important throughout all education, from primary school until university in Japan. And it's very, very different if you're job hunting with a Waseda degree or with another university's degree. But it really depends. Of course, the companies that you have access to, the interviews, the job interviews that you have access to, and even the meetings, like explanatory meetings with companies that you have access to, are very limited if you are not from the Ivy League of Japan. But it doesn't mean that women graduates from these universities, these minor universities, aren't as motivated, because, for example, the respondents that I mentioned, she was the only one that I interviewed that was not from an Ivy League university. She was from Musashino University, which is a very minor one, a very small university, and she struggled a lot more because she would send him a resume and she would not hear back. Well, if you have a Waseda degree, then you would always hear back. And when I was studying in Waseda too, so when I applied to these meetings with companies, I noticed that I was always among other Waseda graduates or Tokyo University graduates. Tokyo University is the top one, or other very prestigious universities. So it's two separate worlds, but still, I don't think the approach and the agency that women can show job hunting is much different.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I have some questions for YAFA and Cristina as well. If we don't have questions from the public, then maybe we can. Or maybe Denise, if you want to ask your questions, since we know each other and we can ask each other questions all the time, then please do.
Just curiosity, I wanted to ask Yafa, she spoke about this porous aspects of refugee camps and of mobility. I wonder if she could expand a little bit on that. It's very curious. Otherwise, I really found your paper, which is very poignant. I mean, it's almost moving. So it was very, very, very interesting. It's something which I wasn't aware about, which I wasn't fully aware. So many thanks for that. That's the first question.
Thank you. I'm really glad that you found it interesting. Recently, in the last few years, I think because of these projects, because Sufra is only one example, but there's been several smaller projects that are built more or less on the same idea. And for these projects to work, somehow there has to be a collaboration between people inside the camp, but also people who are not refugees, who are actually citizens of the country, to be able, for example, to register the project legally, for example, or to be able to have a bank account or any legal aspect, because if they are inside the camp, then they're legally suspended. They can't have access to all the legal structures. So this kind of collaborations or these kinds of sisterhood kind of became as support between women who are citizens, who are able to provide some assistance and who want to help, and women who are refugees but have a completely different set of skills, but they all have like that common interest. So by this means of collaboration, you have more citizen women getting into the camp and deciding to participate in the activities of the camp and getting to know camp women and getting to know camp life. And also it's the refugee women now able to go out with such projects and to present their cultures and their ideas to women outside the camp and people outside the camp. Because before this kind of period, there's been this really strict division between what is inside the camp and what is outside the camp, and also with the presence of social division, not just a legal one.
Thank you. And second question for Cristina, you talked about patrimonial violence, but you were seeing any through your source, have you noticed what other types of violence are you noticing? And if you could tell us a little bit of how agency, how women exhibit agency when it comes to other forms of violence you're looking at from your source?
Okay, thank you for the question. It's very rare to find other type of violence in the suppliche, because the suppliche are mainly about civil litigation. So the main type of violence is the patrimonial one. I found some suppliche on inmates, on women inmates that asked for mercy to the Lord, but they were very formulaic and very specific. So there aren't any text or I don't know. Yeah, the main type of violence in the supplica is the patrimonial one, and it's the I think it's the main interesting point of this supplica, because we don't find very often patrimonial violence in explicit in this kind of source. So yeah. I don't know if I respond to your question, but this is...
Yes, which means that Azolina's case is kind of, reflective in general of what women had to go through during the time period you were exploring. And Anna, just a small curiosity, was a very interesting paper as well, and it's something which is very distant from what I study. And I kind of wonder, we're very much surprised at these conditions which women have to submit to in order to find a job. I wonder, because our culture is quite different from the Japanese one, I wonder if, to what extent are they exposed to other job cultures outside Japan, and what is their reaction, and how do they consider what happens outside Japan in terms of finding a job? I mean, do Japanese tend to go abroad to study and then come back? They get, sort of a taste of what happens outside and what they have to comply to when they come back. What is your opinion? Do you have any information about that?
Well, yes, actually, I've met a few women who studied abroad or were half Japanese, half Thai, and had lived part of their lives in a different country, or had experienced job hunting in the United States, for example. I've met some of them. But still, I would say that all of them, even if they might have had a wider perspective. They might have been much more aware of the fact that this wasn't the only way of job hunting. But still, the peer pressure and the social pressure and the pressure from the company is so strong that if you want to find a job in Japan, you have to do as everybody else is doing. It's really, I don't think, I didn't have the time to show you any pictures or to tell you at length about how peer pressure is strong in this context, but I only mentioned that they dress in the same way. And when I said that they dress in the same way, I mean exactly in the same way. They all buy their suits in the same two shops, if they have the money to afford it, because they're really expensive. But Waseda graduates all bought their suits in the same shops and from the same brands. Same color, because you have to wear black. Since the 80s, when there have been the bubble burst, and the salarymen were sort of in mourning for the economy, black became the color, the standard color for suits, professional suits in Japan. So you have to wear black. You have to, if you tied your hair with a different color, you have to tie them black again. You have to wear certain hairstyles women have to wear a specific, very specific type of makeup. You don't have to wear anything that is branded, because if you wear something that is branded or different, of a different color, people in the company will notice that you're different. And this is not a good thing for them, because by accepting to be like everybody else and kind of deleting your identity from the surface, you're showing that you're willing, that you are, you don't privilege your individuality, you privilege what the company wants from you. And this is what companies look for in employees. So I don't know if that answered your questions well, but yeah, even people who had experience abroad, even if they didn't like that, they didn't like Shūkatsu culture, they had to adapt as everybody else, unfortunately.
Yes, thank you very much.
I also have a few questions. I don't know if there's time for all of them, but one thing that I always wanted to ask Cristina is, I know that you have taken Azolina's case particularly at heart, because I've heard you talk about her many times, and I know that you took particular care in studying her case. And I wanted, just leaves me wondering, what about other peculiar cases, or why did you choose Azolina's case as particularly representative? Why her? And if you can tell us something more about maybe some other, if there's time, some other woman.
Yeah, I could speak for hours of Azolina and other women. I chose Azolina case because the suppliche in Taddeo Pepoli's court are very similar to each other. There are a strong structure and a legal formulary. They all look the same. So Azolina stuck out, just came out of the rest, and it's one of the few cases, but there are, that allows me to reflect on how Azolina decided to perceive themselves, to self-represent themselves. Because Bolognese suppliche are different and similar in a way. On the lettre de remission in France, there are more a tale. There is more of a tale of the in the text, but Azolina's case, yeah, allows me to reflect on her agency. But there are others, not so many because of the structure and formulary, but there are others, like for example, I found a supplica of one widow, Gente, that pleased the Lord for justice, because after her husband's death, the sons of her husband that were not hers live her in poverty, and so she was out of her house with no money, and so she made a petition to the Lord asking for justice. But so there are fewer than I hoped, but there are some. I hope I answer your question, Anna. Okay.
Please go ahead if you have a question.
I'm Isabelle. I asked to comment a little bit. Isabelle Chabot, sorry. I don't know if you see me. Oh, you don't see me, only hear me. Okay, so I'm Isabelle Chabot, and I welcome you. It was a very interesting panel, very different, different cases, but interesting reflections and thinking about agency, which is not very easy. I mean, Denise has underlined the fact that the term can be overused or misused. So it's very important to be very precise and in the way we use it in different sources. I mean, medieval sources like Cristina, or interview like YAFA and Anna, or I mean, you have also, but you try to listen to the voice of women and try to understand if there is a sort of agency in their way that they do not revolutionary the system, but try to. So I just have two comments. One for Anna. I know that it's a very general one. But I went to Japan 2 years ago, so I was quite amazed to see young people all wearing their black suits, and also women wearing. But what you see in the public space in Japan, what I think I've seen in public space in Japan, these groups of men after the work who are drinking with their boss, and it's quite depressing. But while women are running at home to do the second job. No, I was wondering if there is a form of critique or actually feminism in Japan that really try to change, because this women economic that you mentioned at the beginning of your paper is quite it's terrible. So how to use women again to change the demography, because the trend is very dangerous at the moment in Japan. And so they use women without changing the way, without changing the gender organization of the family, of the work, which is quite terrible. So I would like, first, if there exists in Japan a form of feminism that criticizes a lot this system. I know it's a huge question, Anna, but just I would like to know if that exists. And to Cristina, but so I think also to the, I know very well Azolina, because Cristina, because we speak a lot of Azolina together. So I think there is one point to emphasize in this very interesting supplica. First, the date. We are in the 30s and in the 1330s, which is probably a time in Bologna where the restitution of the dowry during the marriage is not actually authorized by the statutes, but by the city laws. Because at that time, in almost all the communes in Italy, do not authorize women of asking the restitution of the dowry if their husband is mismanaging the dowry. So what's interesting, very interesting in this supplica is that this woman use the mean of the supplica to challenge the right, to challenge the law that does not exist at the moment, that does not authorize women of asking the dowry during the marriage. There is a very interesting article on this problem by a jurist who explained very well that at least by the end of the 13th century, jurists asked the lawyers to change that, and to authorize women, married women, to ask their dowry back if their husbands are mismanaging the property. No, so in that case, what's interesting is also in the knowing of the law, or the absence of the law. You have a woman, a married woman, who construct a tale. Her husband has a lover, will spend the money, and that will how do you say? Sorry, avoid younger. The boy or the daughter, I don't remember if it's a boy or a son or a daughter, to later inherit the property of his mother, you know. So she construct a tale, because she knows that the common law, the statute law, does not authorize her to ask for her dowry back, and using the mean of the supplica, she tried to get this. This is the goal. I don't know. We don't know if Azolina had her dowry back, but what's interesting here, that is challenging the juridical system, which at the moment does not authorize women asking their dowry back. So this is a very interesting point. There is violence on one side. The violence, patrimonial violence, has to be defined more precisely, but precisely. But I mean, that's Cristina to do that in a thesis, so not in a paper. It's to she has a very short time to explain what she means, and it's very important to define this. But what you can see here, this very special agency of women trying to challenge the law or the absence of law, by, in that case, using a direct mean, which is the supplica. So it's not, how do you say, banale. It's quite interesting. So I stop. Very interesting papers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Cristina, should I start? Should I answer first? Thank you very much for the question. It's a very interesting question. So there is definitely feminism in Japan. There are definitely activists in Japan. But the interesting thing is that usually even scholars that study Japan don't know that. It's a very niche area, even for scholars of Japan, because Japan is usually perceived as a very conservative country, because it has had the same political party, the Liberal Democratic Party, in charge of the government since almost continuously since 1955. So basically, it has had the same rule of a very, very conservative, very rightist party. So politically, it is a very conservative country. But the reality is that the majority of Japanese people are not happy with the party. Majority of people don't like the LDP. But for how the election system is structured, they have to, like, basically the LDP gets elected every time. So it's interesting that even scholars of Japan don't know that there actually are powerful grassroots movements, civic movements, and also feminist movements. For example, I just read a book about the movement to ask for the right of women to keep their surname in marriage, because right now they can't. A couple has to adopt one surname, and it's in 97% of the cases is the husband's surname. So there is since the 80s, there has been a a strong movement against this, to change this. But it's very, very hard to change these kind of things in Japan. It's very hard for feminist movements to be successful. I don't know if you know this, but there, after the Me Too movement in Japan, a feminist activist created something similar that is in Japanese is Shūkatsu movement, that is written similarly to the Me Too, #MeToo movement. And she was advocating for women's rights in the workplace, and it started off as asking companies to not force women to wear high heels in the workplace. And that was very famous all around the world, but she got a lot of backlash for that. Feminism is very much frowned upon in Japan. The very word feminist, weirdly enough, it has a very strange meaning in Japan, because since it's a foreign word, for some reason that I really don't know about, the word feminist in Japan does not mean feminist. It means a man who opens the door for women. So a gentlemanly man. So a man who acts kindly towards women in a gentlemanly way is called feminist, according to the meaning in the vocabulary of the word feminist in Japanese. And also the word gender. People don't use a lot the word gender, and it's also very frowned upon. If you talk about gender, if you talk about feminism, pretty much as it is in Italy too, you are not taken seriously. So these movements might be there, but they have huge obstacles to overcome. So thank you again for your questions. Cristina.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Isabel, for your consideration and question. I think that it's important to stress that Azolina Supplica was accepted by the Lord and became a decree. So the construction of the tale, as you mentioned, is important, because how Azolina chose to represent herself and her case was useful to her, but also to the Lord, because she wants to be perceived as the good mother, good wife who suffered violence from her husband. And but it's also important that the Lord could show his merciful power and chose to accept her supplica as an act of mercy in a way. Yeah, Azolina used the supplica to challenge the law, the law that didn't allow her to ask for a dowry during the marriage, and that's her agency. But in the same time, we have to stress that Azolina's supplica was accepted by the Lord and became a decree. So in a way, Azolina's supplica became law, because Taddeo Pepoli ruled, making decrees that accepted a supplica. So yeah, she used these methods to challenge the law, but in a way she makes law. So it's important to stress these two topics, but I don't want to be I don't want to focus especially on Azolina agency, because it's Azolina tales and Azolina agency is connected with the Lord's power. So I don't want to be naive and just think that Azolina had the power to change the law. No, she hadn't. But with her supplica, we can study this yeah, this power in a way. But yeah, I don't know if I respond to your question. Maybe we can talk about it later. I hope to respond it in my thesis. But Okay, we have 5 minutes.
Isabel, please feel free to come back to us if you have some more things to say or answer or comments.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's interesting. I was invited in Japan in the Nara Women's University to take a talk and explain what was women history in Italy. So, but this is an interesting case of a university. They explained me that it was a new. Do you know Nara Women's University? It's very interesting because it was founded by women on the model of the Oxford and Cambridge colleges, women's colleges of the late 19th century. And so it was a sort of, it seems to me, I mean, that they explained it to me that it was one of the first women university. And it's still only for women, only for girls, but now it's not for. It seems to me that it's not for feminist reasons that girls go to that university like Samuel College in Cambridge or others in Oxford. But it's they explain me it was because families want to protect their girls during the studies from the boys, I guess, from young men, and so it's a completely different meaning. I was quite surprised. I thought it was much more I mean that kept that university kept the feminist origin, and I think it's not the case, but it's a very superficial impression, but still it's very interesting. No, I wanted to know that I mean how they can think to change the demography without changing this economic model that allows young men to work like mad people and then go to drink at night and be at home very late and leave the burden of the family only on women's shoulders. I mean, the result is what you've shown us at the end, is that there is no change in demographic trend, because women work more maybe, but they do not have children. So there is no help for young women for the care of children, for example, because, for example, France is a country where women work a lot, and they have and where women have a lot of children, 2.7 for which is incredible, much more than Italy. But this is because the state offered to the families, to women and men, a lot of structures, how do you say, needy schools and everything to help women to work and be also women, a mother. Is there something similar in Japan? I mean, they try to implement women's work, but also the structures to help them. No. So this is my first comment. And to Cristina, yes, of course. No, of course, Azolina did not change the law, but she acts. And if her supplica is, how do you say, accepted by the law, by the Lord, this is interesting because it creates an exception. That may be, so it's not, I mean, she's not so powerful to change the law, but still a little bit. And in any case, what would interesting to know, but it would be difficult, I think, is how was she alone in constructing this supplica, which seems to be very clever in order to challenge the communal statutes, which do not allow women to get their dowry back. So was she alone? Was she helped by notaries? Was she? But I think that women knew the law and knew the possibility to change it. I mean, I'm sure that Denise agreed with me. I see she agrees because I see you. You don't see me, but I see you. Okay, so I think it's an interesting case also for this. Okay, thank you.
Thank you again for your question, which is another interesting one. I would say that right now in Japan, it's not so much the state that is creating the right benefits, is giving the right benefits for women to take care of their children and work. Because, for example, one issue that is it's very much talked about is the nurseries, the number of nurseries available, and they are not enough. And the government has been saying for years that they are going to improve that, but they're still not enough. Companies, I would say many companies, maybe not most of them, but many companies are creating welfare systems within them to help women a lot. And these benefits are open to both men and women because of the Equal Employment Opportunity Law requires them to give equal treatment to men and women. And in some cases, the benefits are huge. You can take up to 3 years of maternity leave, paid maternity leave. You're paid less, but 3 years, you can take up to 3 years. And then when you come back, you can choose to work part-time for even a long time, even many, many years. You can choose to work part-time so that you can take care of your children when they are young. And so I would say that women right now are given a lot of help by the companies. But the thing is that men, even if they are given the opportunity, they are not really given the opportunity because every time I've heard a company representative talk about these things to a mixed audience, so both men and women, they usually said something like, even one of our male employees took paternity leave, and they would laugh like it was a joke. And this happened many times. Like they talk about this like it is a joke. So it's easy to see like why men would not be encouraged to take paternity leave. Since we don't have much time left, as Elisa let us know, I will give the floor to you, Cristina.
Yeah, I will be very, very short. We don't know for sure if Azolina was alone because I wasn't able to find the original petition that she submitted to the court. She was helped by a notary to write the petition, the legal terms, and so on. But we can't know for sure if the idea of the petition was hers or of a notary, but I agree with you that women have knowledge of their rights, so I hope that Azolina think about the petition for herself and for her son.
Okay, Anna's Zoom is frozen.
Okay, but we're finished, right?
Yes, sorry, Anna was going to just thank you all for coming, but her Zoom has obviously frozen. She's right next to me, and we just wanted to thank you all for your participation. Thank you, Denise, for your very meaningful discussions, and everyone for your questions and your comments. Thank you so much for participating, and also feel free to write to us if you feel you have questions later or you want to take up the discussion. So thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.
Have a nice day. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a nice day.